One of the honors of ministry, maybe the greatest of the honors that are part of the job, are the memorial services. The lives that you get to witness to and hear of. All of the pieces of these lives, the good, the hard, the courageous, the stumbles, the grace, the laughter, the love, everything that is part of a human story written as we write them, a lifetime of days. Each one offers some insight, some lesson, something extraordinary. And I do have my favorites. The ones I really have loved with a particular kind of love are the ones that have been about people, services honoring people, people who lived life on their own terms. And let me be clear, I'm not talking about life on your own terms in some kind of narcissistic way, some kind of self-indulgent way. I have very little respect and probably a secret, though now public, vendetta against lives that are bold and self-centered and even successful in some worldly way, but leave a wake of personal carnage behind them. The people I love, the lives I delight in and feel so honored to celebrate, lead a life on their own terms that also manages to love deeply and build friendships and give to light to others and make the world better. I love the people who, when they are fully themselves, are also leaving a life behind them like Johnny Appleseed in a tutu, full of joy and skipping, but also planting orchards of harvests, sweet harvests behind them. When I think of these kinds of lives, of Stu Aubrey. Stu had grown up in Kansas City, Missouri, a tall drink of water, smart and full of life. He had 2 adoring daughters and an adoring wife in what was a partnership of real equals. Stu had gotten early onset dementia in his late 50s and would die 10 years later. But he used those 10 years, the ones he was still able to speak coherently, testifying with his wife to Congress about Alzheimer's, to raise awareness and support for research and support for families. Before that, he followed his nose to where and what excited him and interested in him, which always related somehow to journalism. He was editor of his school paper. He got a master's degree in journalism. At his service, we heard about all of his adventures, his time as a Rotary Scholar in Ghana, later the editor for the Peace Corps magazine, a speechwriter in Washington for Congressman Sid Yates, then for the president of IBM, and how he'd then gotten a job doing PR in a relatively new entity called the Children's Television Workshop for a show called Sesame Street. But Stu's dream had always been to buy and be the publisher and editor for a local newspaper, telling local stories and being a force for good in the community. So at a certain point in his life, he and his wife decided they would take the leap, and they looked all over the country at what papers were for sale at a time when you could still make a living at running a local paper. And they found one in Cranford, New Jersey, and off they went. He loved the work. She did the back end, he was the front side of the house. They increased circulation 67%, got into a local corruption scandal, revealing it, that is, with libel cases and crowdsourcing their money for legal defense. He thought of the paper, of all media, as a public trust. When he got his diagnosis, he said to his wife something not filled with pity for life that was closing in on him, but gratitude. "How many people get to live their dream?" he said to his wife, Bev, referring to their work with the Cronford Chronicle. His was an amazing life. It was this amazing spirit. I knew him, of course, but all the stories in the service were from people who knew him before I did, who talked about all the chapters of his life and the joy that he brought to life. Each unscripted person who spoke mentioned something too that his family had mentioned to me. Well, there was the story of him riding naked through college on a horse, but they didn't all mention that one. They mentioned to me mentioned in the service his love of show tunes. His college friend recounted seeing Stu for the first time walking through campus as a freshman, singing at the top of his lungs the title song from the musical Oklahoma. "Oh, Oklahoma, where the wind goes sweeping down the plain." I don't remember if it was someone from his DC days or Sesame Street or both who talked how as a junior staffer he would walk regularly through the office singing tunes, mentioning his penchant for that same title song. There was so much joy, so much abandon that was a through service, a connection to these descriptions of how Stu walked through the world, so often singing. So when we ended the service as planned, which was an odd plan in a way, with a medley of show tunes that Stu loved, you can imagine when the last one, Oklahoma, queued up, the place dissolved in tears. Well, this year, another such life force passed across the great boundary between this reality and the mystery beyond us. George A. Miller didn't want a memorial service, and the family ultimately decided to just gather at a place called Sam's. I'll tell you about that later. But I wanted you to hear a little more about him because George Miller was another one of those people, these big lives, and I miss him. Maybe especially in these times when things feel scary and there is this temptation to live small, I need to hear told these kinds of stories. Maybe you do too. So indulge me in a little eulogy for George. George A. Miller grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, an only child with a father who was an itinerant minister, a Unitarian. George didn't have a lot growing up, but he was smart, and giving credit where credit was due, as he always did, he mentioned in his life the story, the teacher who in high school, junior year, seeing how gifted George was in math, suggested George apply to a place called the Wharton School. George had never heard of it, but he took the advice and he applied and he got in, and it would open up worlds for him. He'd go to graduate school in business at UC Berkeley, get a job with American Express where he'd quickly become the youngest vice president in the company, maybe even in its history. Later, he'd migrate to Capital Group, the largest institutional investment company in the country that handled, among other things, large pension plans so that the fate of hardworking people were in its hands. And he'd move up to the head of research, again, quickly. I interned at Capital Group as a college student one summer. Janet McKinley, who's singing in our choir and would later marry George, was a family friend who also worked at Capital and hooked me up, another star there, and hooked me up for a summer job, which only convinced me that I should go into ministry. It's a great job, but I wasn't good at it. I remember George coming to the office once or twice, this larger-than-life force of energy and joy and intensity and all of that being in the office when he was there. And then when I showed up in San Francisco, called to this congregation, George was a member here, and Janet too. It turns out that George had met the Reverend Harry Schofield when George was at University of Pennsylvania and Harry was serving at First Philadelphia Unitarian Church. And Harry took George under his wing and they had this incredible friendship. And so when George moved to San Francisco, years later, Harry was serving this congregation and that friendship just rekindled. There are books, and I am going to get them right after worship and put them out on a table as you leave, and you're welcome to take one. Books that George encouraged and helped Harry pull together as a retirement project, going through together Harry's sermons to pick the ones that seemed the most timeless, and George not only midwifing the project, but underwriting it. George had that kind of spirit. Loyalty to those he loved and respected. Creative energy and perseverance to see almost any project pulled forward to completion against all kinds of obstacles. The building he lived in was a brewery, an old, great San Francisco building that was going to be torn down, so he got folks to buy it and retrofit it and turn it into apartments. He loved this restaurant, Sam's Grill. Any of you know Sam's? On Bush Street, one of the oldest restaurants in the city. And he and all his friends would hang out there regularly. Political leaders, journalists. Last time I was there, Willie Brown was there. Poets. So when it too was going to be sold because it wasn't making money and turned into a pizzeria, which to George was just unthinkable, he got a couple of friends together and he said, look, we have memberships in clubs. I have a membership of, I forget what, the Bohemian Club or something. He said, this costs me a lot of money and I never go. Why don't we all give up those memberships and just put that into the restaurant? And that's the amount it loses every year. So we'll keep it open and it'll be our club. So they did that. It was creative, it was visionary, it was outside the box. They saved an icon and this gathering place. That was George. He conceived of and created the Miller Scholars Program at Berkeley, where he'd done his graduate studies. It pulled together students who had done 2 years of community college and let them finish their degree at Berkeley, which was this great opportunity to open up possibilities to gifted students, and actually a brilliant economic investment. George had done well financially, enough so that he retired at 60. And his motto was he wanted to die broke. By the time his money for the Scholars Program is finished, it will have put 500 to 800 students through school. But that might also include the band scholarships that he funded each year. He said the football team could have bad games, but the band never let you down. And before women's basketball was hip, George invested in the women's team, and he loved getting invited to the annual Christmas party where he, a tall man, had to look up at the stars in their heels, bask in the glory and the joy of all their families who were there to celebrate with them. George and Janet believed in investing where it made a difference, where it wasn't splashy. When I arrived, we were finding leaks in the center roof. There was water infiltration, and they underwrote the work. No plaque. They bought tubas for the band. One of the retired ones is in the corner of his living room. George told me that when Berkeley needed new bathrooms at the faculty club, he and Janet underwrote that too. And when they asked if he wanted a plaque, he said yes. And he told them, put it in one of the urinals, right where you want the men to aim. But only one, because I'd like to decide who else gets dedicated too. George and Janet started a microfinancing bank in Vietnam in the early years of the Grameen Bank, aimed at helping women, and to date it's helped over 45,000 women, and it's still going. They were given an award by the Vietnamese government that came with a lapel pin, which was sort of unassuming. Didn't look like much to them, but they realized what an honor it was, the full sense of what it meant when at the airport as they left, it parted the crowds in front of them when people saw it. George Miller rode Muni. He didn't care if his hair was messy. He said his favorite word was enough, knowing enough was the key to being happy and living a grounded life. You got to spend your time and your money once, he would say, so choose carefully. He taped and watched the city council and other committee meetings to know what happened in local affairs. I could tell so many stories, and I only know a few. But here's this other thing about George when we're talking about living large and joyfully. I only ever saw him in a t-shirt. He had these signature t-shirts with these sayings on them. Some weren't his. This one is just a favorite that was out in the world. And I thought it was good to hang it on the pulpit because then it could lower the standards of the sermon. Most of them were his sayings, and he'd have them printed when he came up with a good one. Same color shirt, I think, Janet, yeah? Same lettering. Gamos, he called him, George A. Miller sayings. There were 45 of them, I think, in the end, something like that. They were jokes, some of them, but there was wisdom in them, rolled in, and it was a walking conversation starter as he moved through the city. So let me give you a few. Life remembers better than it lives. Right? This reminder as we go through it to know that it's worth it and often more meaningful and happy looking back than when we're making it in the moment. And that's okay. Everything ain't the Alamo. A reminder to keep things in perspective and not get our knickers in a twist about absolutely everything. Don't confuse a bull market with brains. A caution to rich people who confuse luck with merit. George was big on appropriate humility. Mother Nature bats last, a reminder of another kind of humility. When I arrived in San Francisco and the tech boom was in full blossom, and a whole bunch of people were coming to town and earning a lot of money and in danger of treating the city, as maybe people always have with San Francisco, as one big extractive experience, he wanted to remind people of the invitation to dig in. And he met me with that t-shirt on. It said, San Francisco, treat it like you might stay. Isn't that a good one? There was one that I actually love and hold on to as a piece of advice that I needed some unpacking of. There were a few that needed some unpacking. Turn the dial, don't flip the switch. It was this advice about realizing how often the change you needed in your life wasn't some massive overhaul, but just tweaking things, every day tweaking them, and to sort of let up on the pressure and just ask how you could just turn the dial. And this one, which I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago, which way would you rather be wrong? Right? That one that's about assuming the best in others and risking on that choice instead of the opposite in those moments when we can do one or the other. George's celebration of life, as I mentioned, was at Sam's Grill. The t-shirts, some of them were hung around the edges of the restaurant. There were buttons with a photo of a Berkeley tuba player and the quote, "The band will never let you down," handed out. Stories were told by his co-conspirators with a sense of humor and adventure and muscle, all that they did to transform the city together. And at the end, 15 to 20 band members during finals week showed up outside the street to play a medley of songs. Much like a day 20 years earlier when the show tune Oklahoma was queued up, when the Berkeley fight song played, even the Stanford grads and the crowd got a little cloudy, got a little verklempt. Thought you might want to see some images. To quote the Naomi Raplansky poem, Housing Shortage, the end of it, "Excuse me for living, but since I am living, given inches I take yards. Taking yards, dream of miles and a landscape unbounded and vast in abandon. You too are dreaming the same. So may we dream big, live boldly, with joy and tutus, planting orchards in our wake, making music as we go, and bless the lives that have showed us and continue to show us how to live with such abandon. Amen.